Coming up, we deconstruct the Black male identity on a dandy episode of the Best of Black History Year. Gender has shaped and continues to shape much of our lives. It's what tells boys to wear blue and girls to wear pink, or is it? From Season 8 of Black History Year, host Darren Wallace sits down with author and academic Marlon Ross to deconstruct the Black male identity in a very engaging and intriguing episode of Black History Year. Enjoy.
Hey, you ever notice how life comes with a set of invisible rules? Not useful ones like don't touch a hot stove. I'm talking about those that say, being a man with too many friends makes you sassy, but don't have too food either, because that's just as sus. Or rules that say cleaning your house and wear cologne makes you less manly, because apparently there's nothing manlier than a sink full of dishes smelling funkier than a white person's dreads. Here's the twist we all saw coming though. These rules, they get even more complex and absurd when you're black. I'm Darren from Push Black, and you're listening to Black History Year. Ridiculous as it is, gender has shaped and continues to shape so much of our lives. It tells us what toys to play with as kids, what careers are appropriate as adults, and even how we're supposed to express our feelings. See, gender norms aren't just about personal preferences, y'all. They're about maintaining the status quo, one that's been subtly and not so subtly influenced by white supremacist notions of what it means to be a man. But in the tradition of black resistance, our people have always pushed back against these arbitrary rules. And today, we're talking about that and much, much more with an incredible scholar working at the intersection of literature, race, gender, and sexuality. I'm talking about Marlon B. Ross. As the author of Sissy Insurgencies, Manning the Race, and other critical writings, Marlon has dedicated his work to uncovering the evolving narratives of black masculinity. This cat is redefining how we understand and discuss these issues. I mean, we're interrogating everything from Martin Luther King Jr.'s performance of masculinity to what we can actually learn from Martin's portrayals of Shanae. No, really. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to question the rules you thought were unbreakable. Stay tuned. First up, today's history story. This week, it's about black men and emotions.
For many of us, the thought of black men crying or showing emotions is a big no. Yet these same men are criticized for not expressing emotions in relationships. The truth is, there's actually a painful, nuanced history behind black men and emotions that not enough of us bring into this conversation. Before colonialism and enslavement, African gender roles took many forms. There were many powerful women, LGBTQ+ relationships were common, and masculinity was defined in various ways. When the Europeans came, they violently imposed their own ideas of gender on black people, and this continued during enslavement. There, whites would force enslaved men to wear feminine clothes and performed acts of heinous sexual violence against women and men while preventing the men from protecting themselves or their loved ones. The point? To emasculate them. Black men's emotions were also policed by whites who used compliance to decide punishments or set working conditions. Being tough was one of the only ways to survive Jim Crow and modern-day racism. Hiding one's emotions is a survival mechanism. The effects of this abuse have been passed down for generations. Today, many of us police our own without realizing we're upholding white supremacy. The emotional tolls of colonialism and enslavement have yet to be fully addressed. Black men need support from our community so they can freely express the full range of human emotions they're entitled to experience.
Hello, Marlon. Thank you so much for taking time out your day to meet with us today.
No problem. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, yes. Well, the way that we like to open up our Black History Year episodes, we ask all our guests the same question. So, what we want to know today is, what does Black liberation look like to you, Marlon?
Wow, that's a great question. To me, Black liberation looks like the total abolition of white supremacy and patriarchy. And I don't think one can be obliterated without the other. Uh, this also involves, at a high abstract level, the obliteration of colonialism, um, with the European powers for centuries that have dominated,
Mm,
and in some ways continue to dominate, uh, because that's where a lot of white supremacy and the particular version of patriarchy that we're undergoing um, came from. Um, I think at the moment we're dealing with a form of, as well, or within that, a form of a out of control capitalism
mm,
where there is great economic disparity. And in this moment in the United States, that economic disparity, as has been the case historically, for the majority population, when they feel economically distressed, they blame other people, especially African Americans. Um, so for me, liberation means autonomy for African American communities. It means
mm.
empowerment, both economic and social. And it also means gender and sexual equality.
Ooh, that's such a rich response, Marlon. Thank you so much. That absolutely sets the stage for the conversation we want to have today. For folks just tuning in, we're going to be exploring the historical and continued expansion of Black masculinity, and in particular, how certain domains of culture have limited or progressed this expansion of Black masculinity. Just take a step back for a moment, just to set the historical stage as well. I want to share a quote from Bell Hooks' text, "We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity." So here she writes, within neo-colonial white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, all the isms you just named for us, Marlon, the Black male body continues to be perceived as an embodiment of bestial, violent, penis as weapon, hypermasculine assertion. Um, how does that resonate with you?
I think it's a very true statement. From the beginnings of the slave trade through the long history, 300 and more history of enslavement, and in America through Jim Crow segregation to the present, the Black male, I would say the Black male person, I tend not to think just to the body, but the person, to emphasize that Black men have brains, have minds, and are not just embodied, because part of this bestiality is the reduction of
Mm,
Black manhood to merely physical and perverse forms of physical embodiment.
mm,
That the Black person, men and women in different ways, but we're focusing on manhood here, that the persons of Black men have been targeted, exploited, and used as a justification for white supremacist patriarchy.
mm,
Um, and of course, we're most familiar with this perhaps in terms of the whole phenomenon of lynching,
mm,
where this was one of the most violent ways in which Black women and children were also targeted, but largely Black men were targeted as a justification for, I would say, for white male insecurities. I think it's very interesting, just to give an example, that when we think of popular media and sociology, in fact, there's a constant attempt to project hyper masculinity onto Black men. So if we think of a Clint Eastwood movie, that's considered heroic. A violent white male masculinity is considered heroic.
mm,
But when Black men behave similarly, it's considered hyper masculine. So even there is a kind of double standard within that concept of the hyper masculine that we see working out. in sociology and in popular and mass culture.
You touch on a very interesting intersection that I feel some folks often overlook, which is the relationship between race and gender. As you just mentioned, the performance of hypermasculinity, it will look and land differently depending on where one is positioned in this racial matrix. With that said, I'm wondering if you could just add a little bit more texture into or insight into how plantation politics, particularly like the division of labor and whatnot, how that shaped the development of Black masculinity in this context.
If we look at the history of enslavement in the Americas and beyond, the institution of slavery was based on the disruption of indigenous African gender patterns, which were very, very, Africa is a massive, the largest continent in the world, and it has many different cultures and many different forms of many kinds of gender systems. So putting that aside for the moment, when Africans were kidnapped from the continent and brought here to perform forms of mental and physical labor, there was a disruption of the gender norms that Africans were familiar with. And this was in order to perpetuate the exploitation of Black men and women. And one of the ways that Black men and women were made to seem perverse and not worthy of citizenship was to mock, ridicule, and dehumanize their gender comportment and their sexuality. For instance, in the institution of racial slavery, we had the notion that goes against European primogeniture, which is the notion that inheritance goes from the eldest male to the eldest male to the eldest male. This was the dominant form of property inheritance in the British colonies, and slavery in the 1660s, chattel slavery, was instituted by saying that for the condition of the enslaved only, it's through the mother's womb, that slavery is dictated by a slave woman giving birth to children. This law, which promulgated in 1661 in Virginia, meant that what became Black or African American people were the only people to be defined as property through the abnormal situation of inheritance being through the mother's line rather than through the father's line. And I'll just give you one example of the implication of that. It meant that a slave owner, an enslaver, could rape his female slaves and beget his own wealth. In raping his female slaves, every child of that slave is a slave. A slave was more profitable than an acre of land. Wow. And so it also meant that those enslaved people could not be entitled to the inheritance of the slave master. So it defines their object status as property. And so that ungendering of African Americans in order to create chattel slavery has plagued African Americans in various ways ever since, although that potential break with the dominant notion of gender that African Americans experience might be a promising thing for African American culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for setting up that great landing point. Leads right into my next question. Very much interested in just gender expansion, gender fluidity, specifically how it's been practiced across Black cultures. But before we get into like the contemporary realm, I'm just curious, just across your travels, across your research, if you came across any interesting findings as it relates to pre-colonial articulations of African gender systems. So here I'm thinking of Ife Amadume's male daughters, female husbands. When I first encountered that text and I tried to articulate it back to other folks, I'm like, Look, the way that gender works out here in the U.S. or in the Western world is very much like basic arithmetic. It's like peanut butter and jelly. That is closer to trigonometry or calculus. That's so many different factors that contribute to the formation of gender. Any insights there at all?
Yes, and this goes back to imperialism and colonization, because when the so-called European explorers traveled to Africa looking really for gold and other minerals, they were shocked to find how diverse
Mm.
the cultures were and how diverse their gender and sexual relations were. The same is true for indigenous people in the Americas. Um, and what they encountered, their explorers and later their anthropologists, fortunately for us, recorded it, although it is also recorded in indigenous African religions, it's recorded in indigenous folk stories. Um, what they encountered were a vast variety of forms of gender conduct and of what we call sexual orientation. The movie Woman King is
Ah,
a
yeah.
representation of one of these in the kingdom Dahomey. There were a group of women who were the main warriors protecting the kingdom, and they were some of the fiercest warriors in the world. They were called Amazons and other things, but that that gender comportment, which was Europeans didn't understand this. They thought this was really strange, but it was a part of the culture of the Dahomey kingdom, that it was women who fought to protect the kingdom. And there are many other examples of this kind of gender and sexual variety. But when the colonists came and tried to colonize Africa, never totally, we think they did, but they never totally did. But one of the main things they tried to do is get rid of that gender variety, to get rid
Mm.
of those different sexual expressions, and to impose upon Africans the notion of Christian morality, which they, not that Africans, we know that Ethiopia was the second oldest
Yeah.
Christian kingdom in the world, but they saw it as their imposing civilization on these very barbaric forms. That notion of the civilized versus the barbaric was one of the ways that they laid waste to and destroyed many of the practices that were indigenous to Africa, including same gender practices that were not familiar to them, and that frightened them. So part of their conquest of the great resources, including human resources of the continent, was to try to control them through controlling their sexuality. And we're living with that despoliation even today.
I'm very curious about the etymology of the word sissy. So this is a central concept to your text, Sissy Insurgencies, which we will absolutely get into soon. But yes, I'm curious about the development of this word over time. And also, how does it compare or contrast with other adjacent identitarian concepts like the swish or dandy or butch or...
The origin of the term sissy is clouded in obscurity, as is the case, because it's vernacular, and we don't always have good documentation for the vernacular. But etymological dictionaries tend to date it from the 1880s as a term that was used to describe an effeminate man.
Mm.
The word comes from sister, and it's a double diminution of sister. It went from sister to sis. And in African American vernacular, we still use the term sis. We say, oh, she's my sis, right?
Yeah.
Sis is a way of denoting a more diminutive, a more feminized form of sister, a kind of, affectionate term for little sister, sis. Sis at some point around the 1880s probably turned into sissy. I theorize, I speculate that sissy was probably originally used by same gender loving men about other same gender loving men. Uh, it, as many words did, it came to the United States around the same time to denote non-normative male, either boy or an adult. And this is not unusual for gender terms. It's that it goes from an affectionate description for female kin to a derogatory term for men who are too much like women in their gender conduct. One example is the term dandy. The term dandy originates in the 19th century in France and in England. And in the late 1700s in England, there was a man called Beau Brummel. And dandy indicated a man, it wasn't necessarily homosexuality. It was a man who was too proper and cleanly in his comportment. You have to remember that in the late 1700s, men were not necessarily clean. they didn't have soap. But Beau Brummel, who was a close friend of the man who became George IV, was very, very particular. He dressed in very extravagant, fine clothes. He bathed every morning. And he was very attentive to the detail of his body, which was identified more with women than men. So there was a kind of gender anomaly there. But what's interesting about the term dandy, there's a wonderful scholar named Monica Miller who wrote a book on Black dandies. During the 1830s and 40s in places like New York and Philadelphia, we had gradual emancipation. People often forget that the northern colonies, the northern states also had slavery. And in New York, for instance, they emancipated people over about a 20-year period. During this period, African-American men were asserting their respectability as men. And one of the ways they asserted that respectability was meticulous grooming and dress. When they went out in public to go down the main thoroughfares, the high streets, they dressed very well, and they represented themselves and they represented the race through their dress. This is a history for Black men who we know are generally known for being great dresses and for being fashion forward. And I will just give one example of what I might say a contemporary dandy, and that is Dapper Dan.
Yes, absolutely.
Dapper Dan, who identifies as straight. So again, this is not same gender necessarily. During the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, a lot of what became the most fashionable form of dress for men, that was promulgated by this Harlem fashionista, Dapper Dan, who took a high culture of fashion and re-rigged it for the street and for African-American male fashion.
Wow. This reminds me of this an early aughts pejorative that's kind of going out of style, but it relates to this history you just shared with us. But this term metrosexual, haven't heard that in like a decade or so, at least. But it's fascinating how persistent these ideas are. You touched upon this notion of grooming as it relates, and cleanliness as it relates to perceived feminine comportment. You write about this also in relationship to at least one historical subject in your text. Specifically here, I'm thinking about Booker T. Washington. We don't often think about these great race men of history in relationship to the sissy figure. But one thing I really appreciate about your text is you touch upon a wide variety of Black masculine subjects who all in some way intersect with this idea. With that said, why did you decide to write about Booker T. Washington in relationship to sissiness?
I wanted to use Washington as the first historical instance because of his own focus on hygiene as
Mm.
the basis for uplifting the race. Washington himself talked about the gospel of the toothbrush, and he talked about housekeeping. He says that when he matriculated, the way he got a scholarship to attend Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, Hampton's administration was overseen by white Northerners, including white school marms, and the woman who was responsible for the matriculation at Hampton was a white woman. And when he got to campus, and he was dirty, but she told him that if he could clean the room well, he could get a scholarship to go to Hampton. And he talks about that as the turning point in his life because he had learned from his mother and from another Yankee schoolmarm when he was a slave how to fastidiously clean. And I say it's like the gospel of the broom because he talks about how he swept and he swept and he swept. Sweeping in dominant American cultures identify with women.
Yes.
And that's why witches ride on brooms, because in European culture, the broom was a totem of the female. And when the female got out of order and became too uppity, she could fly on her broom. It became a weapon rather. Okay, but anyway, I get off that.
I love that. Thank you.
But so the broom, it has a different connotation in many African cultures, the broom and sweeping. But so Booker T. Washington sort of took on this mantle of being a man who was willing to humble himself and do feminine tasks in order to become a leader of the race. When he founded Tuskegee in the 1880s, he was not shy about teaching his students how to make a bread properly, how to brush their teeth, how to do things that identify with domestic economy. That were, it was a role that was identified with women. And the reason I say he was doing this is because he was trying to make himself less intimidating as a man gaining power with the white power structure, including the president of the United States. He was the most influential Black man in America from the 1890s to his death in 1915. By being not a super masculine man, but by portraying himself as more feminine, he was able to make himself acceptable to the power structure, and they liked dealing with him. Carnegie and all of the Roosevelt, all of these people who donated immensely to Tuskegee, they felt that he was an acceptable person. This went along with, of course, a political program of not demanding political rights immediately, but instead focusing on self-help economic rights.
Yeah.
The thing I say about this is that one reason that I was able to identify Washington as a potential subject was the attacks on him by W.B. Du Bois and by I.W. Wells Barnett and others who attacked him for, Du Bois says, he sapped the manhood of the race. Manhood meant not only the way you conducted yourself as someone deserving power in the political realm, it also meant manhood emancipation, because really, remember, only men could vote during that time. Only white men. So when he says sapping the manhood of the race, he's saying that he's taking away the Black men's manhood rights to franchise and also to being in the conventional role of provider and of political head of the race as well as of their families. During that time, I say Du Bois is punking. Is punking Booker T. Washington in public when he attacks him in that way. And Booker T. Washington in his private letters understood that and said that he would just ignore it in public. because he was trying to accomplish something that Du Bois obviously was opposed to.
Oh my goodness! Thank you for sharing this very rich and messy history. But it brings up two questions for me. One, you introduced this notion of conduct. I think is really, really important to kind of center here, specifically as it relates to this notion of morality or ethics. And one thing that really jumped out at me when I read that framing of conduct is this internal pressure that comes as well. Is almost like double consciousness, right? It's very much being aware of how one is being perceived and then trying to modify that to kind of meet the criteria. If you could just say a little bit about that.
I wanted to shift away from a notion of merely identity, as though, we may or may not be born sissies. I don't know. But, but identity sometimes seems to be something that is just natural to a person on the one hand. On the other hand, I wanted to get away from performance, almost a sort of theatrical notion of putting on and putting off a certain kind of behavior. I wanted to look at this messier, grayer area of conduct, something that we learn, regardless of what our natural propensities might be, we always learn how to behave in society, in our families, in our schools, in our houses of worship. We learn how to conduct ourselves. And I wanted to bring attention back to the fact that these terms like sissy, butch, femme, they all have ethical and moral implications, and conduct gets at that. This is why a term like hypermasculine can be used as a weapon against Black men, because it's saying that Black men are somehow morally deficient in their conduct as men. And so bringing attention to conduct is something that we learn and unlearn based on both external and internal pressures. We can begin, I think, to better dissect these very fuzzy terms. They're fuzzy in sometimes the way they're used, but they're very dangerous often because they can evoke violence against individuals who do not conduct themselves in the way perceived as appropriate, especially in a public context.
I want to center a term that you coined in the text, particularly gentle manhood leadership. And you write that this refers to a series of African-American leaders who displayed a conduct gentle manliness, which entails not only a man's demeanor, manner, dress, gesture, and gait, but also his temperament, choice of vocation, and attitude towards racial uplift. So we touched upon at least one figure who would meet this criteria, but I'm curious if you can point to any other kind of historical figures that can kind of clarify this idea of gentle manhood leadership.
Yes, I would point to two, and one I wrote about extensively in Sissy Insurgencies, the book. That's James Weldon Johnson. And the other one I didn't write about as much, but I would like to talk about a little bit, and that's the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. James Weldon Johnson is this extraordinary person, and he was groomed from an early age. He grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, with parents who were middle class. His father worked in a restaurant as a kind of the person who greeted people and who, was responsible for meeting the public. But he had a very gentlemanly air. He was a kind of dandy, we might say. Mm-hmm. Johnson, who at first became a school teacher and then principal in Jacksonville, but then developed a career in professions that are not necessarily thought of as a hard, political, aggressive profession. He became a composer of Broadway musicals and of songs. He was a poet and a novelist. He was also a diplomat, and diplomacy is one of those fields where men have to be gentle. Men have to develop and cultivate themselves as making peace, right, as opposed to making war. He was the first head of the NAACP, of the African-American leader of the NAACP beginning in 1920. And the reason I describe his leadership as gentle is because he came to the NAACP at the height of lynching in America.
Mhm.
And he led the NAACP against this scourge. But he did so in ways that celebrated and promoted, in his own leadership style, diplomacy and representing to the world a cosmopolitan air. He was a man of multiple talents, and he wasn't afraid to display the side. For instance, his fiction is about a sissy boy. His novel is about a young boy who's too soft and who's racially ambiguous and who's too soft, and who, when he encounters the violence of lynching, is frightened away and defects into whiteness because he can pass as white, because he can't deal with the harsh realities of being a Black man. And so he was exploring what it means to be a strong Black leader. And in one of his poems, he describes leadership as being able to bend like a tree in the wind, right? And he demonstrated that in so many ways in his leadership of the NAACP. It is also not by mistake that he is the person who wrote the Black National Anthem, the words to the Black National Anthem, and the music too. And he's identified a lot with, when that song was first composed, Black schools took it up all over the country. So he was strongly identified with the nurturing of children. He composed it for the performance of young school children. Wow. So the notion of being identified with nurturing, with school teaching, which is often identified as a woman's vocation, he wasn't afraid to take that on.
Wow. But you also mentioned King. If you could touch on
that. In every way, the Reverend King comported himself as a heteronormative man. Okay, so I'm not talking about his sexual orientation. I'm talking about the way he conducted his leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, by focusing on a nonviolent resistance, which was perceived at the time as too soft. And Malcolm X famously, in 1963, attacked Martin Luther King's leadership by saying, "Why are you putting women and children at the front of the battle line? That's where men deserve to be." And King responded to that by reaffirming the power of nonviolent resistance. People called it passive resistance, and he said, "No, I don't want to call it that. It's nonviolent resistance." And he describes nonviolent resistance actually in military terms in responding to Malcolm X and others, in trying to say it's not a matter of weakness that when you see people protesting in the South and going into the fetal position to be subjecting themselves to the arrest of the white power structure, that's not a sign of weakness, it's a power of strength. When we reach turning the other cheek as a principle of Christian love, that's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of moral strength. He was perceived as, let's say, too gentle by the Black Power movement that emerged in the mid 1960s, and he responded to it by not abandoning notions of nonviolence, but by trying to say that this binary doesn't work, that this binary of warring hardness versus passive resistance.
I really appreciate how you think through the nuances of Christianity and how often within like revolutionary movements, Black movements, it can tend to be framed as soft, as capitulating to a certain kind of moral perspective that's not born from Black liberation. And you write about the too good boy as a construct as it appears in the Black church. I'm curious to know more about what do you mean by the too good boy? And I'm wondering if you could speak about this in relationship to Baldwin, how he may have subverted this or advanced it. Yes.
Mhm. Yes, the notion of the too good boy, a boy who is too good to be a genuine boy, uh, it goes back a long way, and it is tied to a kind of conflict within the institutionalization of Christianity in America. Um, there was a movement in the 19th century called the Muscular Christianity. Because some of the Christian pastors, white Christian pastors at the time, thought that that Christ was being portrayed as too gentle in Christianity, as to identify with the female domestic sphere. So the notion of Christ as being muscular was being promoted in order to overcome that. We have a similar conflict within African American communities where the African American church is sometimes, I don't want to say dominated, is sometimes strongly influenced by women, church mothers, for instance. And if you go to virtually any church, sometimes there are more women than men in the pews, okay? And this is partly because part of the principle of Christianity is turn the other cheek. And Christ as a figure is someone who is a martyr, right? Is someone who is vulnerable and who focuses on self-sacrifice rather than a kind of warring masculine hardness. So we see this dynamic in the Black church, whereby on the one hand, the church wants to raise good boys. It wants boys who are Christ-like. It wants boys who can sing in the choir and play the piano and do good recitations of poetry and scripture. On the other hand, all of those characteristics in the dominant culture are identified with femininity. And often this creates a kind of internal conflict within the church. And while boys are supposed to be good, if they're too good, they become sissified. They become slightly problematic. And that's why sometimes you have pastors preaching sermons against perversion and against men not being men in order to try to what Evelyn Higginbottom calls to instill respectability politics in terms of gender back into the conduct of the people. Baldwin grew up in the Pentecostal church. His father, actually it was his stepfather, was a preacher in a small storefront church. Baldwin rebelled because he was not his father's biological son, and the fact that he was a too good boy. And by this, I meant that he was tied to his mother's apron strings. His mother called him her right hand man because he had, I think, 9 younger siblings. He was the oldest. He took care of them. He babied them. He changed their diapers. He was good at cleaning, all the things that, women are nurtured to do in dominant culture. Baldwin writes about this in his fiction and in his memoirs, his autobiographical writing. He writes about being misunderstood, and he writes about the experience as being perceived as not gender conforming. But rather than shying away from it, in many, many ways, Baldwin embraced it and used it in order to develop a strong presence as a writer and a speaker. having become a preacher a preacher in the Pentecostal church at the age of, I think, 14. And in Harlem, he was known for this under the tutelage of Mother Horn, who was a very well-known female pastor. He developed this skill for oratory. So as he develops into his adulthood, by the 1960s, he was using that skill of oratory for the purposes of promoting the civil rights movement. He was one of the most powerful spokespeople for civil rights. He's on all the TV shows being interviewed. He's doing debates in the United Kingdom against American conservatives. He is one of the most famous literary figures of his time and was very much in the public eye. Being in the public eye, his sissiness was also in the public eye. And he did not hold back on it. He did not present himself as more masculine for the sake of public consumption. In fact, so much so that when Time magazine in, I think it's 1963, put him on the cover, when you read the article on the inside, they describe him as sissified. They say he holds his cigar in too effeminate a manner. He speaks in too proper terms, these are all identifiable markers of being a too good boy or a sissy man. And he exaggerates his speech. He's too dramatic. He's too flamboyant. All of these terms were signaling not only his sissiness, but also at the time his homosexuality. He was writing about homosexuality from the 1950s. So it wasn't something that he was necessarily hiding. But these are all ways of saying that he was inappropriately male. I say he embraced it because he also wrote about, in his civil rights polemical work, he writes about Black men in the South. Because we know that one of the things Jim Crow tried to do explicitly was to emasculate Black men, was to make them, to say they were always boys and could never be men. Okay. And so, but he reframes it. He says, when I watched Black men in the South, what I watched is men who adapted to the violence of the Jim Crow regime by not losing their masculinity, but by adapting their masculinity to be heads of their households and yet to still be gentle. I think Martin Luther King Jr. is a representative of that, okay? That what he learned in his household is that you had to be fluid. You had to be both nonviolent, a gentle man who espoused gentle values, at the same time that you were a strong leader. That wasn't necessarily a contradiction. And this goes all the way back to slavery. Men and women worked side by side in the fields. And even after slavery, they did the same. That one scholar points out that from the early 20th century, Black women were in the workforce. That is, both parents in the household tended to work from very early on. And that meant that labor had to be shared in many instances in different ways than was the norm in dominant white America. So Black men have had to adapt because of the pressures of white supremacy, have had to adapt and learn how to be men under circumstances that for many other people would have defeated the culture. I will give one more example from, let's say, the 1980s, 1990s. We think of hip hop and rap. Often people attack it as hypermasculine. There's a lot of sort of masculine posing in rap, but what people tend not to see is what is highly characteristic of Black manhood culture in general. We can see it in relationship to Black men's relationship to their mothers. So I think of Tupac, and I think of his song, Dear Mama. If you go listen to Dear Mama, and you see the other side that is not promoted by the dominant culture, Black men who are tapping into a certain kind of vulnerability, even as the dominant culture refuses to see their gentleness, their capacity for deep empathy and sympathy and connection. it would be impossible for us to have survived as an African American culture without that capacity to adapt, because, of course, there's so many ways economically in which the system has tugged African American men away from their families through incarceration, all the ways that we know, we don't even have to repeat. So in just those ways in which the dominant culture has tried to, we say, emasculate, has tried to devalue Black men and their strength, Black men have responded in a variety of very complex ways with many different attributes that get reduced to hypermasculinity in dominant culture.
Okay, I'm gonna jump around a bit. I know I gave you a roadmap, but the road's wide open now. So you brought up the emasculation of Black men. In our check-in, we talked about, what I name as not even a budding. This seems like this has been around perennially, at least since I've been alive. But this perceived notion that there's a conspiracy to intentionally emasculate Black men, and that the media contributes to this process of emasculating Black men. How do you respond to this claim that Black men are being emasculated today through the media and through other means?
It's interesting because this goes back to African American sociology in the 1940s, where there was a theory that a part of the way racism works is to emasculate Black men, not allowing them to be providers in the home, not allowing them to be good fathers to their children, et cetera. And this was taken up in the 1960s as government policy by the Johnson administration, by an infamous policy report that was written by Monahan, the Monahan Report. It's deeply problematic. It's understandable that people would react this way, that it's a conspiracy, but it's deeply problematic. I would give the example, often this conspiracy comes in the form, in terms of social media, of the meme of, look at this famous star who puts on a dress in order to make it in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Black man putting on a dress. That is taken as the ultimate example of emasculation.
Yeah, yes. Not mass incarceration, not violence.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that to a large extent, it is really a distraction, because Black men are not the only men who have put on a dress in order to produce humor. It goes the way back in vaudeville culture that white men were also doing. I'm not excusing it. I'm just pointing out that as is often the case with a double standard, if a Black man does it, it's something radically different than if a white man does it. But I think more importantly, emasculation is a problem, but I would not use that term. I would say that it has to do with the disempowerment of Black people, whether men or women. And part of that disempowerment works through distraction. Distraction is one of the magic tricks of white supremacy. It causes us to pay attention to something that is really relatively minor. The surveillance, profiling, and arrest of Black men and women, but especially Black men is where the bulk of it occurs, it is a conspiracy, okay? But it's not that a group of white men got together and decided to do it. It's that economically it was beneficial to the United States at a point when the country was turning away from industrial output to a service economy. And Black men were seen as an excess labor force. That excess labor force got turned into incarceration. So incarceration is a way of making money out of the exploitation of Black male and female persons. So I put out that point because we know that two-parent households do better than single-family households. Black people have adapted. I mean, single-family households, yes, they are very rampant in African American community. But I would point this out: Black women and Black grandmothers, and sometimes single Black men, they raise great Black men all the time because they understand that gender is not an ironclad binary. And they understand that strong women raise strong men. And even sometimes, in the absence of Black men, due to the systematic incarceration of Black men, to me, that's a much more important issue than the so-called demasculation through Black male stars cross-dressing. Now, there's one other aspect. I don't want to go on too long, but there's one other aspect of this that I think is important. If we go back to Flip Wilson,
Geral Deine,
Geral Deine. If we go back and look at the of Geral Deine, that's a Black man putting on a dress. That representation of Black womanhood is actually not only very funny but very respectful. He's not making fun of Black women. Go back and look. He's not making fun of Black women. He's representing a Black man's adoration for strong Black sassy women. Okay? Now, I'm not sure that some of the more contemporary men who have impersonated Black women, that sometimes it becomes a caricature rather than a kind of homage to Black womanhood. And I think there are many instances of that happening more recently since the 1990s and into the 2000s with a variety of figures. So I think what people are seeing is they're seeing the caricature. They're seeing how sometimes Black men putting on a dress, they're demeaning Black women. And I think they're picking up on that and they're saying, well, this is emasculation. So it simplifies and reduces what is actually a very complicated phenomenon.
This is so fascinating. Okay, I'm going to toss out just a few media properties because it just brings to mind just this conundrum around when Black men decide to put on a dress and perform. Who tends to be attacked versus who tends to be kind of embraced or celebrated. As you were speaking about Flip Wilson's portrayal of Geral Deine, it made me think of Martin Lawrence, in particular, the show Martin, the figure Shanae, right? Which I'm somewhat ambivalent about. I don't even have like a cohesive thought, a way of understanding it. Of course, when I'm younger, we're laughing, but what are we actually laughing at? Is it because it's a femphobic portrayal that's trying to make hyperfemininity or Black hyperfemininity the butt of a joke, right? But then, I think a little bit forward to another instance where Martin Lawrence donned the dress, and never did he have to receive these claims of being emasculated. The film Big Mama's House, where he plays this undercover cop and like a grandmother and whatnot. I don't recall any claims of Black men being emasculated writ large, or even particularly Martin Lawrence in that context.
I'll take Shanae.
Okay.
For me, and it's difficult because a very skilled comedian can make you laugh even against your better judgment. And I think this is the case with Martin Lawrence, who's very talented. Shanae is funny, but sometimes what's funny is based in a kind of mockery that is, I would say, I don't want to say self-hating, but self-conflicted.
Yes.
Shanae is not just femphobic. It is also class-phobic. It's representing what is unrespectable womanhood at a particular moment when presidents of the country, not just on the Republican side, but also on the Democratic side, are using the so-called welfare queen as an object of disgust. So Shanae is taking that kind of general public disgust with a Black woman who's too sassy, too uppity, too much in her own power as a ghetto woman, okay? This is all about class. And it's someone who's very successful, a Black man who is very successful in Hollywood, using an inside joke of the sassy Black woman and putting it out to a general public to ridicule Black working class women at a point when they are the main target of trying to get rid of the social welfare program that was being put forward by at first Reagan and then Clinton, who you may remember in one of his addresses to Congress said, "We are going to end welfare as we know it." Black women are not the majority of people on welfare, but they targeted Black women in order to justify a new kind of national economy that would get rid of the social safety net for all people by reducing welfare. And so what troubles me about Shanae is that it feeds into that political and economic dynamic of an upper middle class man, actually a very wealthy man at that point, using the image of a Black working class woman to kind of fuel our own self-doubts about what it means to be a Black woman, working class, single mother.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Thank you for all the gems and jewels you just dropped there. Really appreciate you, Marlon. This does kind of lead me to think about just the denigration of the sissy in social media writ large. I want to cite from this particular article by a brilliant author, a man named Dion S. Hawkins. He's the senior editor of The Reckoning. And he wrote a piece titled "Sassy is the New Gay: How Language Perpetuates Veiled Homophobia," I would say also cisphobia or sissyphobia, and toxic masculinity in the Black community. And here he tells us that, sassy and zesty are examples of how fast aspects of dog whistle language can appear in our community. And he wrote this article because he was spurred by a tweet shared by a Black woman that says, "Men that cook are sassy to me." I mention this because he also, in doing his own kind of vernacular research, he put out a call to his masculine friends, asking them for a list of all the things that they were told was considered sassy or zesty if a Black man were to do it. So from his gathered list of responses, we learned that having too many male friends can be seen as sassy or zesty. Having too little male friends can be sassy or zesty. Too many vacation pictures with no women. Ordering martinis at a date. Listening to too much R&B music. Taking multivitamins and supplements. My goodness. I'm curious, Marlon, what led you specifically in your life to write about this particular subject? Have you encountered any of these kind of absurd claims in your life as well?
Yes. This is why I coined the phrase sissy liminality. Manhood, masculinity is deliberately difficult to enact because it creates a notion of self-policing. You have to be very careful not to be too much or too little. Too many male friends, not enough male friends. So how much is too much? And that's kind of the condition of the sissy. It creates self-surveillance, and not only society constantly policing how you behave, every little detail of how you behave to make sure you're a proper man, but also when you sort of internalize that, it means that you're constantly watching yourself in order to conduct yourself in whatever the right way is. And we are in a moment when, as a result of second wave feminism, as a result of African-American feminism and many other in the LGBTQ movement, we're in a moment of transition. And so people are hyper conscious of the difficulties of what it means to be a proper man. The reason I embarked on this study was not only because of just seeing this in the scholarship as an African-American and gender studies scholar, but also from personal experience. I was a too good boy growing up. I was a sissy boy, but I grew up in South Texas, where masculine culture is very strong, and especially in sports. I played football in junior high and high school. I, conducted myself as much as I could as a proper masculine boy. Uh, but there was always this little bit of self doubt about whether I was doing it right. And I'll just give you one thing I talk about in the book. Is one day in high school, I was carrying my books, like holding my books close to the chest. First of all, I was carrying too many books. So another sign, see, this is being too much of just all these books behind me. I was carrying my books like this, rather than having a couple of books, swinging them at the side, the way most boys did in high school. And another fellow teammate on the football team, a white guy, said to me, "Marlon, why are you carrying your books like that? That's like a sissy," or something like that. And I was like, I had never thought about it. And I change the way I carry my books? I don't think so. Because it was convenient. You can't carry a lot of books to your side, okay? But I started thinking about that in many other instances. We call them microaggressions today. Many other instances of surveillance and self-surveillance that I underwent as a young as a boy and a young adult. It helped me to think about the history and the scholarship and the literature. I think in more complex ways by using my own personal experience of what it means to be a too good boy, to be, the pianist for the church, for the Sunday school, etc. So I started thinking about James Weldon Johnson and as a gentle man. I started thinking about James Baldwin as a young preacher. I started thinking about Sylvester, the singer, and the fact that he was he was a young kid in the Pentecostal church, and Little Richard, who also grew up in the church as a very talented musician. That it's a very common African American experience to be in that liminal position of not man enough and not quite what I call a swish, or what used to be called a swish, someone who's outwardly flamboyant, to be in that middle ground, and people not quite sure of whether they should police you or to what extent they need to police you for proper comportment. And the last thing I would say about that is that it's just amazing to me the way figures like Baldwin and Little Richard took what could be seen in very negative terms and used it to become very successful in different venues, very successful men. And Little Richard, his very gender fluid performance has been copied by rock and rollers all over the place, all the way to UK and Germany. It became a way of being rebellious on the stage while playing rock and roll. And these men were often very heteronormative, these rock and rollers, and yet they adopted it because they saw how talented and extraordinary someone like Little Richard was.
Indeed. Okay. I'm trying to coalesce a great landing space for us, but one thing I absolutely don't want to lose sight of is the notion of insurgency. I think that's a very interesting additive when we think about the question of the sissy. And I love the way that you open the text with this question: can the sissy be insurgent? How might the sissy make way for Black liberation? Do you think there's a relationship between that?
I would say to answer the question in a kind of simplified way, I would say yes, the sissy can be insurgent. And I want to just reference Huey Newton when he made an address to the women's liberation and gay liberation movement when he was Minister of Defense for the Black Panther Party. What he kind of calls out what I'm calling sissyphobia and homophobia. The notion that a sissy cannot be on the front line of the liberation movement. The fact is that a lot of people who've been on the front line of the Black liberation movement have been sissies. And I think he understood that, and he was calling out some of his own fellow Panthers to make sure that we did not get distracted, so that they did not get distracted by these questions of what does it mean to be a panther, and whether gender performance was to be equated, a certain kind of masculine gender performance was to be equated with being a strong Black leader. I wanted to use the term insurgency because it's identified with revolutionary warfare. And in stereotypical terms, historically, insurgents are seen not as women and not as sissies, not as same-gender loving men. It gets encapsulated, it gets emblematized by a certain kind of insurgency gets equated with a certain kind of masculinity. So I wanted that sort of irony to point up the fact that if you look at the history of African America, what you see is that in order to be great leaders, African American men, and I would say women also, but I'm a scholar of masculinity, that African American men have had to be adaptable in terms of their gender comportment. They had to be adaptable in their personal lives, their everyday experience under white supremacy. And they took that adaptability to gender conduct and they exploited it in order to make a way for the fight against white supremacy and patriarchy. There are many examples, but I do think of, for me, Baldwin as one of the most compelling instances of this. It's not by mistake that in the mid to late 1960s, Baldwin was being attacked by people like Eldridge Cleaver for his homosexuality, but his homosexuality seen through the lens of his improper, non-masculine, or not masculine enough comportment. And some people say that Baldwin caved into that. I disagree. I think Baldwin was always himself. And you just have to go look at the video and the photographs and at his writing to see that he responded to it, but he responded to it in a variety of ways and comported himself as who he understood himself to be. So yes, the sissy, not only can the sissy be insurgent, we cannot have real insurgency without sissies, is the other way I would put it, because even the notion of the front line, which is a masculinist image, the front line of the battle. It's hard to change our thinking because it's so embedded in our language and in our ideology. But we are undergoing a change. Issues like non-binary, gender fluid, these are controversial, but they're helpful because they're forcing us to think about, really, what is good character? What does equality mean? And what does strength mean? These are characteristics that are shared by men, women, whether cis or trans. To be strong is not a gender characteristic. It's a value, a moral value of one's character that does not have a gender basis. And that's what we have to learn. And when we begin to learn that, we'll also learn what it means to be Black and queer, or Black and straight, and how in some ways those terms are irrelevant to what's truly valuable. And I would just say, what is truly valuable? That we have equal access to shelter, to freedom, to the vote, to economic opportunity, all of these things, which actually these things have nothing to do with one's gender comportment. And it's what we all need. And that's what we all should be fighting for.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. That's such a powerful last word. I'm sorry, producers. I have to ask this last question. I promise you, Marlon, we'll let you go after this last question.
That's fine.
But we love to end our conversations with a bit of speculation as well. And I love just your methodology of speculation that takes place in your research as well. Just picking up on that note, one thing that I think about in terms of the future, and I think about what might Black liberation look like and mean, is I often question, how do we get beyond the gender binary? From your perspective, Marlon, what might the most liberating future for Black masculinity hold? What might it feel like? And how might society move closer towards this vision?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, but a challenging one, because it requires us to imagine a future in which we have abolished the incarceration state. I would start there. I think that it's ironic. Black people have been at the bottom of American society for a very long time. But there's a lesson that we can learn from African American community about, I call it adaptability. Yeah. You mentioned double consciousness. It's actually kind of triple consciousness, because we Black people are very aware of the implications and the pressures of white supremacy. We're also aware of the pressures and implications of patriarchal supremacy and how it has damaged and Black men experience this at a very, very visceral level. And so we should take that knowledge of what it means to be pressured, to be called hypermasculine, to be called beast, to be called all of these things. We should take that, and we should take our responses to it and systematize them and collectivize them, and think about what it means as a community to respond in three places to African Americans at always the forefront of America's equality, demands for equality. In the home, it means becoming, within families, more cognizant of embracing our own differences, our own gender and sexual differences, embracing them and exploiting them toward the benefit of the family, the way the Black church exploits a sissy boy's piano skills. And houses of worship in the whether it's the church or some other kind of house of worship, that's still a central place for the making of Black culture. And unless we overcome what we're calling toxic masculinity and homophobia, that leads to some of the bad practices, sexual practices of some Black preachers, if we don't overcome that, the church will not be able to continue to be a source of strength within the culture. And third, within the schooling and the larger public sphere, there is a counter movement to feminism, Black feminism, critical race theory. We're all aware that the reason they're focusing on the schools is because they understand that young people are learning a different language, a different vocabulary, and they're learning to be more comfortable in themselves. And so all of these laws that are being put forward and so frequently aimed at Black people and Black queer people, all of these laws are intended to stop the progress. So it means we're on the right track. When they're putting up all these laws that say, don't do that, don't say gay, don't teach this critical race theory, they don't even know what it is. But when they're saying all of that, it's because we're on the right track. We just can't get distracted by the counter movements that are trying to keep us apart and keep us distracted on matters that in the end don't count for the things that I talked about earlier, like access to the vote, economic prosperity, consolidation of the race, and self-empowerment of the race. All of those things are the things that will get us to where we need to go in terms of gender parity as well.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that final word, Marlon. We truly appreciate you sharing your expansive knowledge and your experiences with us, and we can't wait to have you back.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I enjoyed you asked great questions, and I enjoyed this conversation very much.
That was the incredible Marlon B. Ross, author of Sissy Insurgencies. Be sure to check out his book and other incredible work to learn more. And remember, y'all, masculinity, femininity, or however you choose to identify, doesn't have to define who you are and how you show up in this world. Don't let harmful social dictates dictate your freedom of expression. You have agency in the construction of yourself and the larger collective. I mean, what do y'all think? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this conversation valuable in any way whatsoever, please share this episode on your social media. Be sure to tag us at We Are Push Black on IG and TikTok. At Push Black, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel like that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work, and you make Push Black happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work. Black History Year is a production of Push Black, the nation's largest nonprofit Black media company. Our team includes Jerea Bradley, Brooke Brown, Somalia Ramin, and Tasha Taylor. Producing the show, we have Sydney Smith and Lynn Webb and Lance John with Gifted Sounds as our editor and engineer. Black History Year's executive producers are Lily Workna and Julian Walker, and I'm your host, Darren Wallace. Until next week, be free. You're living in history.